I am Jakub, founder and CEO of Apiary. And I want to tell you a little bit more about us. Just very quick numbers initially. We're about 3 years old, getting in on 4 years, but I like saying 3 years. We're 22 people, 90,000 users, and we really help people build APIs. And I want to tell you a little bit about why and kind of how we started doing that and kind of what we try to actually do. We started with, oh, and one last thing I forgot. We're in Prague and in San Francisco. So there's actually a Cafe Prague in San Francisco. So when I say in Prague and in San Francisco, I don't mean we run the company off the cafe. We have an office here and we have an office in Prague. We're originally from Prague. And we really started with the war that was waging in our previous lives and previous companies between backend developers and front-end developers, and the API kind of being used as that natural divide that kind of lets people duke it out between the two teams. And I kind of put these little kind of idea clouds or tag clouds for the older among you around the kind of front-end and back-end developers to kind of paint a little bit of a picture what they're thinking about. But the short story is everybody's thinking about something totally different. Like the front-end guys have a completely different mindset, the back-end guys have a completely different mindset. And very frequently you see this kind of wars of people saying, well, it's not working, it's because the API is ill-designed and we can't like do our beautiful UI front-end stuff because the API doesn't work. Or the back-end guy saying, the API is fine, you're just using it wrong. And this kind of this back and forth pathing. And we felt that that was really silly and that there should be something that helps back-end developers like design their APIs and like think about their APIs and test them, and then let the front-end developers separately build stuff on top of early API prototypes or feedback or experiment with stuff. And then those two things could be kind of each cater to their own group, but fundamentally they could meet somewhere in the middle and have like a common ground where we are the peacemakers of those two groups. We help people kind of find a common truth between their own kind of individual interests. So that's what we started with. That's kind of how we started thinking about it initially. And my first attempt was to find out what other people are doing instead of going out and building it myself. And so we talked to a lot of companies, and we talked and talked and talked. And I figured out early on that everybody's building this in their company, and eventually at one point in time. They usually start with, well, what can possibly be hard about building APIs? We're just going to write everything ourselves. And then later down the road, they end up building a lot of infrastructure around the API, and it just kind of accumulates. And it was really silly, and it kind of felt like everybody's building APIs. The APIs are everywhere, and everybody's reinventing the wheel, like all the time, like including like Zendesk and Twilio and Stripe and everybody. And so that's kind of how we started thinking about it. And this is sorry about the bullshit detector here going off, but this is a slide from my investor deck. But essentially, kind of what I keep telling them is every kind of 10 years you have a big kind of topic of what is a mega trend. And I think in this decade it's really APIs. Like everybody's building APIs, and we're progressively moving into building APIs all over the place. And it's interesting if you look at the kind of previous trends of what's happened kind of in the decades of how software was, how building software changed over the decades. When you go back 10 years, everybody was building like web frameworks or HTTP servers. Like 2010, you would never think about building that. Like that's just commoditized. Like it's ridiculous. Like why would you do that? You just kind of do Rails or whatever. Whatever you like, but you don't build one on your own. In 2000, you totally build your own. And I think we're there with APIs. Like you're totally building your own right now, but in 10 years' time, it's ridiculous. It's like it's not your core competency, it's not your business, it's just really cost of doing business. It's really something that fundamentally begs to be outsourced if somebody gets it right. And so we're trying to get it right. That's our mission. And we started early with helping people write documentations. If you describe a documentation in Markdown, we parse it, we render it really nicely, we add code examples on top of it. We have like 15 different languages right now. When Apple introduced Swift, we had like, in 3 weeks' time, we have Swift code examples, and boom, we deployed them across all of the API documentations, then run on Apiary. So it was like kind of really quick uptake for Swift as well. And as we were playing around with it, we kind of figured out there is another documentation that happens throughout the life cycle of building APIs and building software, and it's almost on the opposite side. It's kind of the documentation that's internal. Like when you're thinking about building a product manager sits down. In API world, it's often like a CTO or a product manager for APIs. But you have to kind of describe what you're building, what you're thinking about building, how you want to build it. Maybe you want to run it past somebody in the company. Maybe you want to run it past a couple of customers. And so we started doing API design, and we started helping people not just document publicly APIs, but also internally, and to be able to kind of share these ideas around and think about APIs and write about them and kind of try to design the APIs properly. And from there, we very quickly went on to prototyping APIs, helping people write code. and kind of build up a whole network, a cloud of things that you can build. And it all runs off the center that you see in the middle, which is our icon for what we call API Blueprint. And that's just really a flavor of Markdown that helps you write about APIs. So it was derived originally from our documentation efforts, and now it really powers all of this stuff. So it powers your continuous integration testing, it powers your prototyping. So for example, when you design an API in Apiary, you get a prototype immediately, you can show it to your customers or show it internally to your front-end developers that you fight with constantly. and then you can kind of, when you're building an API, you can run tests off the same kind of platform, and when you document, you can document in the same platform. Eventually, we'll be able to collect feedback and go back to the design stage and kind of start designing your version 2 or whatever you want to call it. And so that's kind of how we kind of build up that life cycle of what's happening in Apiary. We've initially launched open source kind of level stuff, parser, compiler, the language for describing APIs in 2012. It was the kind of big relaunch for our API Blueprint. In 2013, we've built up a really beautiful kind of API documentation that now scales across devices, so you can have like mobile-enabled documentation on an iPad, iPhone. It has several different layouts. And this year, we've followed up with Apiary for Teams, which is kind of on the level of if you have a team of 10, 20 people. And eventually, we built Apiary for Enterprise in September. And it loosely kind of translates to about these customers. So if you're an individual API developer, you just really care about writing about your APIs. But if you kind of have a product manager, then you really kind of are looking at kind of the design kind of capabilities in Apiary. And if you have multiple API teams and you have an API architect that kind of oversees all of your strategy in your company, then you face a completely different set of problems, like making sure that all your APIs are consistent and that you build them in the same style. And so that's what Apiary for Enterprise is for. So that's what we built. We have been quite happy with the customer uptake. We've managed to scale both across a large number of users in Apiary, but across some very large companies as our Apiary customers. But I also want to show you kind of our integrations that were built on top of Apiary. This is just like a couple that I really like that I pulled off just before the presentation. The guys at Lonely Planet built an RSpec adapter that can run your API Blueprint stuff in RSpec, so you can test it if you're a Ruby shop. The guys at Amazon built, one guy from Amazon built Aglio, which is like a really nice kind of offline renderer for API blueprints. There's several different kind of desktop client implementations. So Paw is a really nice OS 10 desktop client that you can like use to send test API calls and really kind of have a nice desktop HTTP client. And the commonality between all of these is that like once you have a description for an API, once you know how an API works, once somebody took the pain of actually describing what it does, then there's actually a lot of stuff that you can do with that. You can feed that into all the products out there that kind of work with APIs and make sure that you can test APIs easily because you pull in all the definition of how an API works, or that you can easily send API calls. Or we have customers. In fact, we have one shop in kind of the business intelligence space that is building a universal extractor out of any API that you kind of feed it the API definition in API Blueprint, and they can extract any data source based on the description that we provide to them. So there's a lot of kind of power to having 120,000 blueprints in Apiary. And so one thing that kind of I have a call to action to you guys is if you're thinking about, if you're dealing with APIs in one shape or form, and if it would be helpful for your customers to be able to load up an API definition that they've created beforehand, then all of API Blueprint is open source, MIT, parser, compiler. We run both the downloadable version, you can get it, or we run an API that you can make the API calls to parse this stuff. So we actively help people to build up an API community around API Blueprint and to kind of have that power of not having to reinvent the wheel all the time, but having to describe your API once and run all the tools of that. That's why I have. Thank you.